Romans Part 3, Lesson 8. This is the last lesson in this particular section of Romans. So what was this section of Romans all about? The S word. What is the S word? Sovereignty, right. So as we did Part 1, it focused on sin and... Yeah, I'm gonna wake up our brains. That's why we do this, actually. So the first was about sin and salvation, right? The second section was about sanctification. The third section, Part 3, has been about sovereignty. And the last section, which we will get to in the fall, is going to be about service and practicing what we've learned. Yes. So that it's easy when you have like an S word that you can remember. So it's not just about sovereignty, it's also about, when we talk about the sovereignty of God, we also talk parallel about, it's not an S word this time, sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man. This section is not just about sovereignty, it always has to be in parallel. This chapter in particular, chapter 11, focuses on that a lot. It's the responsibility of man as well. All of them have, though, but we need to keep that in mind. So today, this week, as you did your lesson, you did your chapter study of 11, and we're just going to go section by section through 11 and see what Paul is addressing. Now, as we get ready for that, what is one of Paul's methods throughout the entire book of Romans? Question and answer, right? He has a question, he asks a question that kind of has been, except for maybe the first one, has been, begged from what he just preceded, what preceded it. Like he was giving an explanation as he gave an answer, and there's like a question that would come to mind. So he asks that question, and the answer to that question almost invariably is, May it never be. No, absolutely, emphatically not. And then he gives an explanation. He gives a longer definition. And then the next question comes up. So a lot of times through the book of Romans, if you will just go to those questions, you see what he's doing, and it progresses the thought through. Okay? We call the entire book of Romans what? The Constitution of our faith. Okay, when you think about Constitution, you think about written statements that define a group or a country. In the case of our Constitution, but in the case of our faith, it lays that groundwork so fully that you can go back to it, and it's concrete and it's known. So we call it the Constitution of our faith. Why? So would that make it something that's important for us to understand? Yes. Is it easy? No. But when you take it in small bites and in chunks, it's doable, right? Did God ever give us anything in the Word of God that we weren't supposed to study or understand? No. Do we always fully understand it? No. It's a lifelong practice. It's a lifelong thing. This is the second time I've gone through Romans. Some other studies I go through more than that. This just is the second time I had a group that wanted to go through Romans with me. And I am back there learning things again. You don't ever get it all.
There was a quote in one of Corrie ten Boom's books. When she was a little girl, she asked her father a question. And he said, when it is right for you to understand, God will make sure that you understand.
Right. It may be, because I've heard this story about Corrie ten Boom, that they were traveling and he wouldn't let her carry a particular case. And she was like frustrated by that, and she was like, well, why can't I? And he said, it's not time yet. It's not time yet. And when she did try, when he allowed her to try, she couldn't lift it. It was too heavy for her. And he said, just like that case, it's not your time yet. When it is your time, you will be capable. We've all heard the phrase, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. The call comes first, right? Who does the call come from? God. I don't call to him and say,
Here I am.
Right. Especially at salvation, none of us do that. There is none righteous, no, not one. None are seeking after him. None. Remember that. None. That's one of the things we learned in Romans is we weren't born this way. I've had people tell me, I probably would have been one that said I've always been prior to my understanding of salvation because I went to church all my life. I was pretty good. Wasn't uncomfortable in church at all. I never doubted the existence of God. I don't have a time in my life that I ever doubted the existence of God, ever. And whatever I thought I understood about Him, which wasn't a whole lot, and certainly wasn't taught a lot in the churches I was in when I was younger, I didn't doubt it either. Didn't doubt the existence of Jesus. Didn't doubt in it. But I was also telling somebody just yesterday, we just passed what many call Easter. I like to call it Resurrection Sunday. But when I was growing up, Easter represented Easter egg hunts, chocolate bunnies, white patent shoes, cute dress. Remember the crinolines?
Yep.
Hat, yes, gloves. And one time, a mitt. Or a muff. It was a muff, I guess. And it probably was a hand-me-down from my older sisters, and I just thought that was the coolest thing, But, flowers, tulips, a lot of times, right? Do you realize that y'all know this, but I got saved at 29, and it was probably Easter the year I was 30, or maybe even 31, 32, really early after that I'm at church, and it was a good church. I'm at church, Easter's coming, messages are being given, and I went, oh, Easter's about the resurrection of Jesus. I went to church for 29 years, every Easter, and never understood the connection.
Wow.
Shame on those churches.
There wasn't anything around that triggered your curiosity, like in
I was in church.
storefronts or-
We had great
I'm talking
children's
about, like,
churches.
commercials or-
Nothing.
Oh, wow.
No, it was always about Easter egg hunts, the Easter bunny, chocolate, the basket. That's why my children did not get that growing up. I was not about to have them think Easter means Easter bunny, chocolate, and baskets, and jelly beans, and all that stuff. Now, did they get candy? Sure. I was a bad mom too. I gave them candy. But it was, and that's why Christmas is not about Santa Claus at all. We eradicated that because Christmas was Santa, not Jesus' birth when I was growing up. And I went to church. They had trees we put things on. They had Advent candles, and it was never, ever about the birth of Christ. So we eradicated all that for our children, because what happens is you're a child. What are you going to think about? You're going to think about candy and gifts. You're not going to think about significance, And it wasn't, I'm an intelligent person. I went to Sunday school in church. I didn't just go to church. We went to Sunday school in church. I can't swear to you it wasn't taught, but it was at church. It was about the Easter egg hunt. Think about it. It's sad. Is there anything wrong with white patent shoes? Well, other than the scuff marks that you had to get out with lighter fluid that my dad had because he smoked and had lighters that he refilled. No, there's nothing wrong with a new dress. There's nothing wrong with focusing on spring being a time of renewal and coming out from, winter time. And if you want to focus on that, that's great. But when you're talking about Resurrection Sunday or Easter, if you want to call it that, then it needs to be only and ever, and the rest just needs to be left out. I personally, and if this happens at your church, just sorry, I'm going to step on your toes, or their toes, but at any Christmas program, when they bring Santa in, it infuriates me. It does. And Easter programs, if you're doing a passion play, if you're doing your cantata, for instance, don't bring the Easter bunny in.
Oh, we do.
Yeah, don't. Just.
It's good,
But how many times, and I've had this said to me, even by good pastors, good Christians, well, it's all about the kids. Is Resurrection Sunday all about the kids? No. Is Christmas all about the kids? No. But that's what we make it. Every program I've seen in churches you have people, the Upward program for basketball, people would say, it's all about the kids, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's about taking the opportunity that you have, that the kids are coming to, during their practice, you have devotions and they have verses they say, but when you're at halftime and the kids are back with the coaches, you have a captive audience that came to watch those kids play. And you use that opportunity to give devotions and give, you know, a message of salvation. It's not about the kids. Sorry. Another soapbox. I must have soapboxes I need to be on today. We'll move on. Okay, in Romans chapter 11, as we're coming to the end, and now obviously you know, there's not like the last time we're ever going to hear the sovereignty of God is in chapter 11, but that's what the focus was for chapters 9, 10, and 11, is as we look at the book of Romans, and it's awesome when we can do that and segment a book and begin to again get those handles, go smaller segments, the bites. But now we're going to look at it in sections of verses. So today, you know, what is the big question that Paul has asked and is going to answer in this chapter?
Has God rejected Israel?
Right, that's the question. Has God rejected Israel? And as Karen already answered the question, may it never be, right? Just about any question. And we're going to look at this in sections. The first section is verses 1 to 6. Next one is 7 to 10. The next one is 11 to 15. Then 16 to 21. 22 to 27. And then 28 to 36. We're just giving us some bite-sized pieces. Do you need me to say those again? Can you read them from back there? Okay.
I can't read that very first.
It's verses, VV is verses
Oh, okay.
1 to 6. I didn't put the VVs everywhere, but yeah, verses 1 to 6. Okay, so the first question that's asked is, has God rejected Israel? What's the answer? No. May it never be. And obviously, that is not the only thing Paul has to say on this subject. What does he say about Israel to help us understand? What does he tell us in verse 2 about Israel?
His people
Who he foreknew, right. So this, I'm just going to put, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Which is extremely important. It's important for us to understand it for the overall idea, has God rejected Israel? Because his people, if we asked who are God's people, we would say the Jews, right? But is that only God's people? No. And that's part of why this is so comforting. So obviously something that we're glad to know as well. Now specifically, Paul's talking about Israel here when he's talking about his people, but it's not just, you know, that's just the first glance, you know, like the first skip of the stone. That stone also connects to us as well. And he says, he then gives us an illustration of how we can understand this through what Old Testament person? Elijah. Okay, what's the significance about what he tells us about Elijah?
Pleads with God against Israel.
So Elijah pleads with God, right? Mm-hmm. And when it's interesting that he says against Israel. I had to look down there. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm. And what does he say about Israel? What does Elijah truthfully say about Israel? Because he's not wrong. They killed your prophets, right?
They're liars.
They torn down. They're liars. I alone am left, right? That's what he says. And they're seeking my life. What is Elijah, by the way? A prophet. So he's saying they've killed your prophets before. I'm a prophet. And, well, he doesn't say I'm a prophet, but we know him. He's like the. You know, if we're going to put a prophet out there, Elijah's up there hugely as one of the top ones. And it's true, they tore down his altars. It's true that they killed the prophets. Is he alone? Is he left alone?
Yeah. Well, he says
He says he is, right.
Yeah.
But is that true? What's God's answer to that?
7,000 men who have not bowed their knee.
Right.
to the knee of Paul.
He said, God says, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal, which is the big idolatry god. And then in verse 5 it says, in the same way then, talking about that, there also come to be at this present time, what? A remnant, according to God's gracious choice. So the next part is, there is a remnant. What's it according to?
To God's gracious choice.
Okay, according to God's gracious choice. And in verse 6, the last part of this, it says it's not based on what?
Works.
Right. Its remnant is not based on works. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of mark out some important words here so that we can highlight them. One is foreknew. We've looked at this before. When we look at the word foreknow about God, when we know God foreknows something, we're not talking, remember, we're not talking about he looked into the future and said, there's some that will choose me, therefore I choose them. That's not what he's saying. Because does God know who's going to choose him?
Yes.
Yes. That's not what foreknowledge is. Foreknowledge has to do with God making a choice. Sorry, I'm going the reverse of the timeline. God making the choice prior. He understands and knows you prior to the foundation of the world. The word know is extremely interesting. If you want to pick a word, and it's an English word, but if you want to pick a word to mark throughout, and really probably Old Testament also, but certainly the New Testament, it's the word gnosis, Gnosis, usually. There could be another, but it's the word gnosis, and it means not just head knowledge, it's experiential knowledge. I always do this because it's like your whole being knowledge, okay? It's the difference in, when I was in college and I was learning about engineering and I was learning about the formulas and I was doing the math and I was taking the classes, and then I went out and got a job, right? And I'm sitting there in that job, and yes, what I learned, book knowledge is what we'll call it, book learning sometimes is what we'll call it. I knew what the formulas or how to solve the problems, but it's a whole different animal to go out there and actually do it. Or, Johnny just finished his training. If all he ever did was sit in a classroom and learn how to fly, and he never actually got in the plane, would you want to get on that plane? No.
After we finished our training, our flight attendant school training, we had on-the-job training
Yes.
for about 2 weeks, where we would actually work the flights and become knowledgeable as to how everything ran.
Right. And then the rest of time, you're learning all the time. You're reacting, but you have that basis behind you. So gnosis isn't just about like reading the word and knowing God that way. It's the idea of experiencing God and actually having a relationship with Him. Okay? Again, if you were reading resumes and you read about a person, that's not a great basis by which to know for sure what that person would be like if they came to work for you, or if you were, well, in that case, came to work for you. So it's a huge difference. But here's the reason I bring up know. If you want to really understand how know is extremely important, go look up, it's really simple, the book of 1 John, and just go through and mark the word know, and then make a list of what you can know. It's an awesome short study. It's a really interesting, something you can do in the summer when we finish this class, is go study that. But here's one that just blows my mind. And Kay mentioned it at the end of the tape last week. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Many will come to me and say, 'Lord, Lord.' And I will say, 'Depart from me, I never knew you.'" Foreknowledge of God. He never knew them. He's not just talking about the people in front of them that he never met, or the people in Israel that he didn't go to their town, or they didn't come to his speeches, or whatever. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying, because that would include, after his earthly ministry, anyone that comes to the end of their life and comes to judgment, and they're going to say, "But Lord, Lord, didn't I prophesy in your name? Didn't I do this?" And all these, that list that you go, "I didn't do half of those things." Scary list. And he says, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity." And that means workers in the flesh, doing things according to your ability. They cast out demons in his name. I didn't do that. I haven't done that. So it's kind of scary, but it's not who you know. You'll hear me say this sometimes. It's not who you know, because we can know God as far as like picking up this Bible, opening it up, and reading it. It's who I'm known by, who knows me. And Jesus knowing me is very important, very important. Being known by God. The remnant by God's gracious choice and not according to works. Not according to works is a huge theme in Romans, is it not? Okay, why? Who is counting on their works?
Jews.
The Jews primarily, but we are too. Sometimes we are too. But yes, at this point he's talking about that because they were counting on doing the law. They were counting on the sacrificial system. They were counting on just being Jew by birth. They were counting on having the temple. They were counting on having the scrolls, which was the Bible at the time. We can do the same. You know, there's parallels in the Christian world. You know, we know what role we're on. We know what building we go to. We're identifying ourselves as I am a blank, you know, whatever denomination usually, or particular church. When you were, as I sometimes will say, carried into a church 9 months before you were born, because your parents, if your parents attended. Many, well, that's the list they'll give you. I think I told you about, and then I know Sandy was showing me something which is very interesting, about asking someone the question, if you were going to the gates of heaven, like you die, you go to the gates of heaven, whoever you say comes, Peter, Paul, whoever you say, Mary, sorry, comes to the gate, and they say, "Why should I let you in?" What is your answer? And as you know, when I was at that cusp of Christianity, that made me panic. What is the right answer? What would I say I had done? I was thinking works. I was thinking works. And or also like going to church and who, which is still works, but I mean which church and who might be your grandfather or your father or, you know, your credentials that way. Same with the Jews, you know, they would have known what tribe they were from, and obviously going back to Abraham, they would definitely tie back. But instead, it's by God's gracious choice. He foreknew, he has a remnant, and it's by his gracious choice. In the word gracious, what do you see? Grace.
But what is this, otherwise grace is no longer grace?
There you go. Why is that, Sandy?
I don't know.
You don't know, okay. Okay, so let's think about the word grace. What is grace defined as?
Unmerited favor.
Unmerited favor, okay. What does unmerited mean?
Not deserving.
Yes, you don't deserve it. Sometimes we'll talk about grace and mercy, and we'll say grace is getting what you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. Think about that for a second. If you were in a courtroom and the charges were dismissed because of whatever reason, charges were dismissed, and it wasn't because you were innocent. So don't get that. You know, you're guilty, but your charges were dismissed. Or somebody comes along and pays your fine. That would be another way, that maybe that you were released from whatever that. or you're in debt and somebody comes along and pays your debt. That could be true of you in life right now, right? You have this, I have no idea how I'm gonna pay this bill, and you go and find somebody's paid it for you, and maybe anonymously. It's awesome. It's awesome. You didn't deserve that. You didn't earn that. It's not just unmerited and undeserved, because that is true, but also you can't have earned it. If you have this huge bill that comes up, hospital bill, accident bill, something like that, and you're just going, I have no idea, I have no resources, I have no idea how we're going to pay for this, and it's forgiven somehow. Either somebody pays it, or the person that could collect says, I'm not going to. I'm just going to forgive this. It's done. You didn't do anything to earn that. You didn't deserve it like you were a better person than someone else. You were guilty. You know, you were indebted, whatever. That's the idea here. But mercy is, that is the mercy of you didn't get what you did deserve, which is punishment or whatever else. Grace is getting a gift that you couldn't have earned, that you could not, you didn't deserve it, you know. We have a tendency to think, and really in our society and the way we do things, is we give gifts that are expected. Like your child has a birthday, you know, they shouldn't expect you to give them a gift, but everyone expects you to give them a gift, right? Grandchildren, whatever else, right? So what if you just pick some random person that you have no connection to and you gift them? Have you ever done that? Especially in secret? You know, the Bible says a gift given in secret is a wonderful thing. It is. And it's not, doesn't have to be anonymous, but it is kind of cool when it is. So that's the idea of why does it say if it were according to works, it's no longer grace? Because if I worked for something, I did merit it. I did deserve it. It's payment for my service, right? Grace is, in a lot of the illustrations, that's what it's about, is if I go and you hire me to do a job, at the end of that time, if I've done the job, I've earned the wage, right? So in Romans it tells us the wages of sin is death, right? If we commit a sin, we've earned death. That's what that means, right? And there's no if really at the end. Since we've committed sin, not if. But so works is, the remnant is not based on works. Salvation is not based on works. Nothing is based on works that has eternal value. It's all according to God's gracious choice. Not the way we would have done it, is it? And not the way we tend to think of it now. We have a tendency to look at people and say, he doesn't deserve whatever.
And that's judgmental. We shouldn't be doing that.
Well, especially about salvation, we certainly shouldn't, but we do. I mean, right? We do that. And in some cases, I mean, there's justice, you know, but remember, God said of justice that mercy it outweighs justice. In his economy, in his way of doing things, do we want his justice? No, we want his mercy for ourselves. And you'll hear me sometimes say, I want mercy for myself and justice for everybody else. You know, and I'm a very justice-minded person, so that's not always a bad thing, because God is about justice too. He's not always about, you know, you getting by with everything. That is not what salvation is about. It's not about you getting by with everything. It's about someone paid the price. There was a huge price paid.
Yes.
Jesus, yes. Okay, looking at verses 7 to 10, it's talking about kind of flowing out of this, the remnant is not based on works. Some group was trying to pursue something based on works, weren't they? Who was that? Israel? Israel sought by works, but what happened? Did they obtain it?
No.
No, they did not obtain it. Who did obtain it?
Those who were chosen.
Right. So the chosen did obtain it. What happened to the rest?
They were hardened.
They were hardened. This is hard stuff. Makes us uncomfortable, right? Now remember, in a previous lesson, we looked at the idea of hardening, right? And it talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and it talks about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. Remember that? Talking about the account in the Exodus, that time frame. Do you remember when we looked at that and we talked about that? Because this is one of those things that I have to just like kind of go back to and try to remember what did we learn. Because this is extremely important. God gave it to us so we can know it. In the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, it was because he would not do what he was supposed to do. So did God harden Pharaoh's heart, or was Pharaoh's heart hardened by Pharaoh? It's
It's a yes to both.
it really is.
Yeah.
Because it even says God hardened his heart, but it's
Because
saying,
of his actions.
yes, because of his disobedience, because of his actions, yes. So in the responsibility of man part, we have a responsibility. And in that, there's an outcome or a consequence. I mean, we can look in our lives, in our personal lives, or in our lives, we can look around us and see there are some people that just won't get cracked. They just get harder and harder. It talks about calcification of the heart in the Bible. The calcification is an interesting thing. We all know about the pearl that's inside the oyster, right? What happens? Do you know where it starts?
This
Grain of sand. It starts with a grain of sand, right? And the oyster produces what they also put on the inside. If you open up the clamshell, the outside is, or I say clamshell, oyster shell, whichever one, the outside's ugly. May even barnacled, rough, whatever. It's not pretty at all. But you open it up and what do you find on the inside? Mother of pearl, right? It's beautiful, isn't it? It's absolutely beautiful. That same coating, because it makes them comfortable, doesn't it? That soft muscle, whatever thing is inside, sorry, that's inside, that shell is, wants to be comfortable. So it's able to make its environment comfortable with that mother of pearl, right? But it's beautiful also. It's crazy how God cares about that, But that's what happens to that grain of sand, right? We all know, we've heard this. I have never seen it happen. But anyway, the grain of sand gets inside, and if you're ever at the beach, sand is everywhere and gets everywhere. Wouldn't you like to be able to cover up that sand with mother of pearl? But that grain of sand comes in, is irritating, and therefore it's covered. And it's just layered after layer after layer with that same secretion of whatever that covers the inside of its shell. And it produces that beautiful little pearl that we find valuable, right? Because we can't do that. Yeah, we can't produce that, and you have to go down and dig, and it's not easy to find. And so that's the idea of that pearl. But it's also the idea of our hearts in a kind of a negative way. Is we have our heart, and by our behavior, we put a layer of hardening around it. And then we do more, and there's another layer. And what ends up happening is something solid like a pearl. Is it possible to break a pearl? Yeah, it is. It's not easy, but it is possible. Certainly we could smash it like with a hammer or with tools or whatever. Can a hardened heart be broken or opened up? Yeah. Remember when God said in the New Covenant, I take your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. So then he writes his law on your heart. Okay, so it's kind of that idea, the calcification. I always think about that pearl. Started out with a little grain of sand and it just kept having layer after layer after layer, and in a beautiful rounded shape, so that we end up seeing it as beauty in the case of the hardened heart, it's not beautiful, it's not hard. But in this case, it's not just talking about hardened hearts, it's talking about people. It's talking about within Israel, they sought it. We're going to say, what were they seeking? Salvation. They were seeking righteousness by works, but they did not obtain it. Can you obtain righteousness by works? No. The ones that did obtain righteousness were the chosen, and that's really important. It goes back to the foreknowledge. It goes back to God's gracious choice. The remnant is by God's gracious choice. So it's the chosen that were that are the remnant, and then it's again not by works. Over and over again, the rest were hardened. Sad truth. Okay, in verses 11 to 15, though, it says, it's answering the question over and over is, has God rejected Israel? But he says, I say then, another question, they did not stumble as to fall, did they? Right? And in this case of fall, it's talking about they didn't stumble so as to fall, meaning to never get up again. Okay? So I'm just going to put that in parentheses. But they did stumble. Again, a lot of times we're talking collectively as a group, not individuals. Okay. Remember at the very beginning of this, Paul is what? In this chapter, Paul himself is an Israelite, right? So where would you put him?
As a chosen.
As a chosen and as part of the remnant, right? Not as part of the hardened. Not as one that's, now at a time he was pursuing it by works, but that changed. Okay, so Paul is here, and Paul's heart obviously is for the Israelites. You know, but he's also facing the truth. Okay, think about that in our lives. Is it better to pretend or believe or hope our loved ones are going to go to heaven someday? Or is it better to face the reality and then address it? Paul's facing reality. There are some that are a remnant by God's gracious choice. The rest are hardened. Has Israel as a whole failed completely? No. They've stumbled, but not fallen so as to never get up again. It's not that there is no hope. But we've got, as we look at our loved ones, as we look at people in our lives, we can't just say, you know, wishful thinking, I hope. You know, we've got to recognize, and I mean that by, again, it's not our place to go inside. I'm not coming to your house and I'm not going to look at your bookshelves. I'm not going to look at your playlist. I'm not going to look at your movies you watch to find something to fail you on. That's not what I'm going to do. But if you're living your life in such a way, whatever that is, like a business person that won't file their taxes, is lying on their paperwork, is treating people, you know, like last week in one of our lists, swindling people. And it's obvious. You know, I'm not going to go in, I'm not an IRS agent that's going to go in and look at their books. But what they're doing is obvious, right? It's also making their heart obvious. It's making their salvation state obvious, because Christians can't do that. Not consistently.
Shouldn't do that.
Shouldn't do that, and it can't be their lifestyle.
Right.
They are not Christians if that's their lifestyle. So we talk about lifestyle all the time now, and we're usually talking about sexual choices. But it goes so far beyond just what you're doing or not doing in the bedroom. It has to do with how you're living your life. Are you a liar? Are you a swindler? Are you a homosexual? Are you a heterosexual immorality person? You know, I mean, what if you are those things, then you aren't saved. And the reality is we need to see that, love them enough to say, we need to talk. I need to tell you the truth. Because I don't want my enemies going to the lake of fire. I really don't. That's the reason I pray for their salvation. It's the easiest thing when we, even in that, was talking about, I was saying pray for your enemies. The easiest thing to pray for is their salvation. It's the most profound thing, but it's actually, it's what I'm compelled. I'm saying the easiest thing I'm compelled to do is pray for their salvation. So they didn't stumble so as to never get up again. But it says in verse 12, well, in verse 10 actually, 11, but by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous, right? So that's an interesting thing. So Israel's transgression, I'll abbreviate, brought salvation to the Gentiles. And why?
Make them jealous.
To make them jealous. Does that cause you to wonder?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, right? I mean, this might have been one of those questions you put off to the side and said, I don't really understand that one. So let's think about it for a second. Transgression is stepping over the law or making your own law because you can fulfill it, you can't keep God's. Those are the kind of the ways to look at transgression. So when it's saying it is sin, don't get me wrong, it is sin. It's kind of like an area of sin or a particular pattern of sin. So Israel's stepping over the law or making their own law brought salvation to the Gentiles. Okay, so here they were trying to get to righteousness their way. They were seeking it by works. Go all the way back to post-garden, slightly after the garden, and you've got the two boys bringing their sacrifices. Okay? I really don't believe that it is what was in their hands that was the problem. It's what was in their hearts. Why they were bringing what they were bringing. It might have been what was in their hands if God prescribed it. We just don't see that in Scripture that He said you're to do one or the other. There's many people that will say, oh, one was a blood sacrifice and the other one wasn't, but even in His law, He has both. So I believe that it was more about what was either easy and I'm going to do it my way. If you look at the difference in Cain and Abel, you don't hear much about Abel except for that he got killed, but with Cain it was I'm going to do it my way. Transgression. You cannot define transgression better than that right there. Okay, so if you want to understand transgression, that's one of the best examples there is. Coming to God the way I want to come to God. And then demanding He accept it. Isn't that what's going on in Christianity today? Right? I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Live my life however you can't tell me. They usually are focusing on us. But really and ultimately they're saying, God can't tell me what to do. Even because God has told us what to do. And what they're going to say is, that's your interpretation. Have any of you heard this? I mean, am I echoing conversations you've had? Because that's what I hear a lot. Well, I don't hear it all the time, but when I have, that's what I hear. And I'll go, well, no, it's black and white, and then I'll go and read the words. I didn't make this up. This is what it says. It's not an interpretation. They'll say that this Bible I have is an interpretation. This Bible I have is a translation. Big difference. Remember? Interpretation is studying and learning and knowing and then thinking and saying, what does it mean? That's a big difference in translating from a language to another language. Okay? There can be interpretation within translation. There can be misleading things. Okay? There have been. There's been Bibles in the past that have been that way. But in this case, we're talking about so Israel's transgression. They're coming to God the way they want. Even what I said about what Jesus said, Lord, Lord, He said, you're doing it your way. You're doing it according to your abilities. That's another way of sin, It's not, it's iniquities and transgression are all aspects of sin. So they wanted to do it their way. They were going to try to, they sought it by works, but they didn't obtain it. So their transgression brought salvation to the Gentiles. Why? To make them jealous. Okay? Jealousy tends to be a very negative word. So it's hard to imagine that God would use jealousy, right? Paul's not making this up. He's telling us what God has put on him to say. Would it make Israel jealous if the Gentiles got salvation?
Yes.
Yes. Did it? Yes. Right? Even in Paul's day, in those early times, you see the first, which was Peter, going to the centurion, the Roman's house. I can't think of the guy's name right now. When the blanket came down, and Peter was called, and he went to the man's house, and the first, it seems, the first of the Gentiles' household got saved, right? Then he had to go explain this to the Jews. Paul's entire people group that he was really sent to was who? The Gentiles. And Paul had to explain this to the Jews. Understandably, we're not just going to accept anything. There needs to be some discernment there. But among the leaders, the idea was, this doesn't make sense to us. We are God's chosen people, right? But all along, throughout the Old Testament, you see, they were supposed to be, yes, God set apart people that were to draw people, to be the light the bugs came to. To be the city on the hill. I know, it's kind of funny, but seriously, what happens when you put a light outside? Bugs come, it attracts bugs. We're supposed to be, and we would have been bugs, we were afar, if you look at the book of Philippians. We were far away from the covenant. We were not part of God's chosen people and the place and everything. We were literally geographically apart, but we were spiritually far apart. And so by bringing Gentiles into salvation, or basically turning and saying, I'm offering it to the world, it included Jews, never excluded Jews. It was just always to be for everyone. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe on him would not perish, but would have everlasting life. One of the most known verses. Used to be, now it's don't judge. So, sorry.
True.
Yes. Gentiles, it's to make them jealous. It also tells us after this that their transgression is what? So we've got number 1. Israel's transgression brought salvation, and Israel's transgression is riches for the world. And then Israel's failure is riches for the Gentiles. It's kind of saying the same thing again, because the world is the Gentiles. So Israel's failure is riches for the world. And then it says, if their transgression is riches for their world and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? Okay, this is true. Israel's transgression is riches for the world, and Israel's failure is riches for the Gentiles. God's not finished with Israel. So when it's fulfilled, when everything about Israel is fulfilled, and it's going to be, and there is more, it's amazing. So there will be a fulfillment. I don't see how y'all read this. I have a hard time reading it, and I'm standing right there, sorry. There will be a fulfillment. And then in verse 13 he says, I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So basically Paul is saying, I'm going to try my best to use this as a tool, to use you as Gentiles as a tool to get my fellow countrymen's attention. If it moves them to jealousy, we can have a conversation, right? Wouldn't that be something you might say? If I can, almost like, if I can upset you, we can talk.
Well, it also might spur them on.
Yes,
Say, hey, I want that.
yes, there you go. That's the other, is, and sometimes we do this to motivate people in a completely different way, like to just take it away from salvation for a second. And you might say, you know, if you work hard, you can succeed. Finish your schooling, or get that job, or work hard in that job and work your way up. And we use others as an example, don't we? Right? That doesn't mean everybody's going to have exactly the same path and everything's going to work out the same way. But generally, and with generalities, we can say, if you will do these things, if you'll take these steps, right? If somebody needed to go through a rehab program, it's been studied. If you will go through these steps, then the success rate is really, really high, right? So we would do the same thing, or Paul wants to do the same thing as fellow countrymen. Say, you know, we missed it as a nation. God has turned to the Gentiles, that's who I'm talking to, but he hasn't given up on his fellow man. He grieves over this. And he remember, I told you at the beginning of chapter 12, I said, you cannot read what he says after this in a calm way. Because he says, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God. He says, you know, it's like everything in him is saying, if I could make it happen for you, if I could pull this out of you, I would. Have you ever had a message you needed to give to somebody that was like that? Where you were just like desperate for them to understand what you were saying? That's Paul in Romans 12:1. And that should be us to anyone, Jew or Gentile, that is unsaved. I urge you, by the mercies of God, if you are saved, present your body. Okay, there will be a fulfillment. And then it goes on and it says, what does it say about the rejection of Israel? If their rejection, in verse 15, for if their rejection is what?
Reconciliation.
Right. So Israel's rejection is reconciliation for the world. Then the opposite, what will happen if Israel's acceptance will be what? Life
From the dead.
from the dead. So you have those two side by side. Israel's rejected and it results in reconciliation for the world, but their acceptance is going to be life from the dead. Whose life? Who was dead? Yeah, the ones that had not yet, right? So it's again, it's talking about collectively about a group. Here it's talking about those who have not accepted yet. So of those, collectively, their acceptance is going to be life from the dead. Does that make you think of Ezekiel? Dim bones, dim dry bones, right? And in that picture, because we've done Ezekiel, you see he saw a vision of a field of bones. We're not talking about dead bodies. We're talking about decomposed, no flesh, bones, scattered bones, and a whole field of them. And what does God do? He collects them into, puts sinews and puts flesh on them, and breathes life into them. It's awesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the picture there of the dead bones is Israel. It's this point, it's this idea that Paul's talking about. when that acceptance comes, when they are they're God's gracious choice remnant, are going to come back because they've partially been hardened, but they're coming back to life. It's going to be God putting flesh on their bones and breath into their body.
Born again.
Born again, absolutely. I was going to say, how different is that than any one of us that got saved? Same, isn't it? Right? So Paul's talking about a specific thing, but it applies to us as well. Remember, that is always true. We have to look in context to what specifically is being talked about, but always take it to the point of where you're applying it to yourself and applying it to the situation. It was true of me. You know, you've heard me put somebody in the bottom of my pool. I always point out there, you know, the pool, the body that's dead doesn't say, I want to be saved. I want to come back to life. It's dead. That's all of us. We're dead. We have no spiritual ability. We have no physical ability. We've got no emotional or mental ability to ask for salvation. God even has to bring us out of the pool and pump enough breath into us for us to then go, I accept. You know, would you, after being pulled out and having, you know, breath come back into your lungs and you're revived, look up and say, I want to drown again. I wanted to stay dead. No.
He has to expel the water out of us.
Exactly. He has to
And sometimes you say, why didn't you pull me out sooner?
yeah. But we're talking, exactly. But did it bother you that it says Israel's rejection? Because what's the topic? Has God rejected Israel? No. May it never be. Heaven forbid. No. So what side of rejection is this? Is this talking about God rejecting Israel? There you go. It's not talking about Israel's rejection, the rejection that God did to them. It's not talking about that. It's talking about Israel's rejection. Israel's the one that rejected, if there's any rejection here. But it created or allowed for reconciliation for the world. Reconciliation, remember, is bringing two enemies together to the point of conversation and relationship. Remember, God reconciled us to himself and gave us a ministry of reconciliation. So if you don't think you have a spiritual gift, you do. But if you don't know what your ministry is, that's it. We also have the ministry of intercession. I mean, I can go through the New Testament and pull out things. We are to do the work of an evangelist, even if you're not spiritually gifted evangelist. So we have we have too many things we need to do. Okay, going on to 16 to 21. It says, and if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also, and if the root be holy, the branches are too. Right? So it's talking about as a group. It just takes a little bit of, we know this about bread. We know this about dough. We see this in a negative analogy in 1 Corinthians 5 where it says a little leaven leavens the whole lump. In a bad way. Leaven usually means sin. Okay? So here it's saying, if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also. And if the root be holy, the branches are too. So think about Israel. He's giving you a word picture here. So as a whole, they're considered holy. As a whole, the tree or the branches, if the branches are holy, then, if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches are broken off, here's the picture that is many times, obviously, it's here, so we see it. If the branches are broken off, and you being a wild olive, so the tree is an olive, you being a wild olive were grafted in among them and became partaker of them, of the rich root of the olive tree, don't be arrogant towards the branches. Okay, so it's giving us two pictures, and it's saying, first, if the first piece of dough is holy, then the lump is holy. And then it says, if the root is holy, Then the branches are holy. Okay, the first piece in these pictures and the roots here would be those patriarchs, the beginnings, like Abraham. You know, Abraham was that first piece, right? And then some of the others. But the branches, so if the first piece or the root are the patriarchs, then the branches here is talking about Israel. And they were broken off. Why were they broken off? What was the reason?
Unbelief.
Unbelief. The Gentiles were grafted in. Why?
Belief.
By faith, yes, by their belief. The opposite, yes. And so then Paul is saying, if you're a wild olive and branch and God has grafted you into the tree, therefore you're now connected to the root. Don't forget that. If you're grafted into the tree, the root is supplying. The root is grafted in, and you're grafted into that source or that root. I would even say the root. I'm wondering about this a little bit more so that it's the vine and the branches. You know, Jesus talks about He is the vine and we're attached to Him. So the source is God. But He says, don't be arrogant. Because you don't support the root. The root supports you. So don't be conceited. Right in the middle of this, it's kind of interesting that Paul brings up arrogance and conceit. At that moment, it's kind of strange to me that he brings it up. The problem is, well, the reality is he knew. And what did happen? What has happened historically? Gentiles have what? Become arrogant towards Israel, haven't we? We tend to think, when we think of the church, we don't think of Jews at all. We think of where we are the church. The Gentiles are the church. We don't think of Jews at all. And Paul's very clear in other Gospels, or other accounts where he talks about the church being Jew and Gentile in one body. It's always. There's always been a remnant by God's gracious choice. They are part of the church. Unfortunately, a lot of times they're very separate. Like they find their own places of worship sometimes, rather than integrating and becoming part of and that, again, is that us? Have we done that?
Our root is Abraham, so.
I'm sorry?
Our roots are Abraham's. Have you all believed?
We are, yes, we are his children spiritually. Yes, they're
Christians should never forget that.
exactly.
So,
That's the thing here, is we should never forget we didn't get there by any other means than by God's gracious choice. So we're not any better, okay? But we talked about this last week, but in the movie, the Paul movie, one of the things that really shows up when you have a movie that's historically, tries to get the historical context and understanding, at the time of Paul, in that movie, at the time of Paul's final arrest, Nero was burning Christians to light the way into the city. There were groups that were sent into what they called the circus, which is the arena, essentially, where people would come and watch while the Christians were ripped apart by wild animals and killed. And Paul was imprisoned, and he was one of the top, most powerful Christians, and the Romans had him under their control. What did that lead to? Arrogance. It's the idea of, I am in control, I'm a power over you, therefore I'm better than you. Okay? Do we see this in our society? All the time. Might makes right is the idea. bullies in school, people that, whether they are bullies and come into power or they have power and therefore they bully people from it. Political, yeah, all the time. Money, you know, in the times that Paul's writing, or when Jesus, remember when Jesus was talking and he said, the rich young ruler comes, or the rich man comes to him and he says, give up everything. We saw that last time. Well, when he walked away, even Jesus' disciples are like, if a rich man can't get in, who can? Because they had the mentality of, if you're rich, you have more favor from God. If you're rich, you're going to get there better and faster than me. And we you know, we shrug and think, how crazy is that? And yet we can fall into that. We look at people that are celebrities or people that have money, and even our voice changes when we talk about them. Don't we? We are impressed by them, or someone with a title, someone that's the head of a company, or someone, I mean, this is not true of Kay. I can tell you from her side of things and from people that are close to her, but if you had the opportunity to meet Kay, would you get excited because she's a celebrity? We have a tendency to do that. I admire her and have a whole lot of respect for her. There's a difference, and I had to watch, was I doing that? I'll be honest with you, the first times I had the opportunity to meet her. I would never presume that, I would not walk in with arrogance presuming she's got to be lucky to meet me. Right? Or that she would have time. But she doesn't see it that way, and she's got some great people around her that keep her grounded too, but I don't think it's her way anyway. But we as humans tend to do this. That when we look at somebody that has achieved or succeeded or has money, but the other end, the bad end of this is when people are in that position of power, however they've gotten it, through election, through money, through popularity, through whatever, it usually turns them into not nice people. There's some great people that have power and position, but there's the vast majority. Go to any high school, go to any junior high. And the popular, when I was in school, the popular group were popular because they were nice. Not so when my kids went to school. The popular kids weren't nice at all. A few maybe, but most weren't. Okay, in verses 22 to 27, because we've talked about this is true. The branches were broken off. Other branches were grafted in. Don't become arrogant. Don't think you got yourself. I've used this before. If a branch is down outside, or actually I guess in this case, a branch would be cut off from a tree. Did that branch cut itself off? Did that branch walk over? And did that branch graft itself in? No. God did. In this picture, but certainly if it was an example of now, if I knew anything about grafting, it would have to be done from an outside force. That branch doesn't do it. It's inanimate. Same picture here. If a branch is grafted in, it's not by that branch's ability or work. It was done for it. So don't become arrogant. You didn't do it. And you're being supported by the root. You're not there, like the root doesn't need you. Right. The root that wasn't damaged, by the way, when those other branches were broken off. The root kept going. Okay. So now in verses 22 to 27, there's some ifs. It says, behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in kindness. Otherwise, what will happen? Right. If you continue, or if you don't, sorry. If you don't continue, you will be cut off. But the other is, if Israel does not continue in its disbelief, what's going to happen?
Grafted in again.
Yes. He will graft them in again. If they do not continue in their unbelief. Unbelief is what caused them to be cut off. If they don't continue in that, they can be grafted back in. How much more will their grafting in be accepted by the tree than the wild olive branches that were grafted in, right? It will be much more. And then Paul reveals a mystery. What was the mystery that he reveals? He says in verse 25, I don't want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation. What is the mystery?
Partial hardening has happened
Right.
to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in.
The fullness of the Gentiles is a time phrase. Remember, we've had the fullness of, well, when the covenant was made by God with Abraham, he said that part of the prophecy that was in that was saying that his people, Abraham's people, would be in captivity for 400 years, 4 generations, until the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. There are these times. So in this case, it's until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. There's a time. It hasn't finished yet. But in the meantime, a partial hardening has happened. What does partial make you think of? There is a remnant. Not all have hardened. It kind of looks like it if you're, looking at it, if you're looking at averages or percentages. After the end of this is part of the mystery, after the end of this partial hardening, and when the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled, what's going to happen? All Israel will be saved, right? What else is going to happen? The deliverer is going to come where?
Zion.
Deliverer will come from Zion. What's he going to do?
Into ungodliness.
Take away their sins. According to Zechariah that you looked at this week, Zechariah 13, it said there's 2/3 that'll perish and 1/3 will make it through.
Sounds like Revelation.
Yes. We looked at this in Revelation, for sure, and that's exactly what it's talking about. The time frame is during the times that we know are coming, the end times, there will be 2/3 that'll perish and 1/3 that'll make it through. That's not said here in Romans, but we have to look at that, okay? So when it says all Israel will be saved, is it talking about the whole, or is it talking about this 1/3? Yes, it's talking about the 1/3. So God can say all Israel will be saved, but at that point, it's the 1/3 that makes it through. And the deliverer will come from Zion and take away their sins. Zion is what? So you know. Jerusalem in specific, yeah, but Zion is in heaven. Okay, but there's also the Zion on earth. So you have to kind of see which one is it talking about.
It's in
And-
Salt Lake City.
I'm sorry?
It's in Salt Lake City.
Okay. Well, that's not the one we're talking about. And without going into, what we studied for 2 years in Revelation, but do you remember the events and what's going to happen? Jesus is going to come from Edom. And he's going to come through the Valley of Decision, through the Valley of Jehoshaphat, and that's 200 miles long, and the blood's going to come up to the bridle of the horse, remember? And so when, in Revelation 19, Jesus comes, his robes have been dipped in blood. Remember that was called the great winepress of the wrath of God? We're putting a lot of parts together. And then he comes, where does he come? He comes to Jerusalem, and the world wars against, the world's armies have gathered against Jerusalem and just about destroyed it. I wonder if that's when many will perish. And thus, all Israel will be saved. And it says, their eyes will see whom they have pierced and recognize that he's Jesus. He's their Messiah. They'll see Jesus, yes. And then Jesus stands on the mountain.
Holy
Mount.
Holy mountain, isn't
Yeah, it's east of the city. What's it called? I should know this. Anyway, somebody can tell me. And it splits to the north and the south. And then there's water that flows, a valley that forms and water that flows between. Jesus comes and he rescues his people. He comes to Jerusalem. It comes from Zion. So that's what this is talking about. The deliverer will come. There's a lot of bad that's going to happen before that. But ultimately, I mean, there's a lot of bad as far as the destruction of the city and coming against. So there's a lot in those couple of verses that needs to be said and covered. But understand this, all Israel will be saved. The mystery is that there's that partial hardening. Why is that a mystery? When Paul's writing this, why is that a mystery?
We don't know that yet.
Well, we're talking about at that time
Okay.
that Paul's, we don't know exactly, we have the prophecies, but when Paul's saying this is a mystery, the mystery is there's a partial hardening. Would they have understood that before?
No.
No. Just like Paul says in other places, the mystery is the church, Jew and Gentile in one body. Was that something they understood before?
No.
No. So he's revealing that basically when he says it's a mystery, it was God always reveals things at the right time to his people. But these are things that were kind of mentioned and are in the Old Testament, but they didn't understand them. Again, the Gentiles were always supposed to be reached by the Israelites. When God says the first piece was holy, therefore the lump was holy, when he says the root is holy, therefore the branches are holy, he's talking about the whole of Israel. And yet, branches were broken off because of unbelief. It reminds me of Paul talking about the woman staying in the home even if her husband is unsaved. And he says a couple of things. Partly, maybe through her quiet and gentle spirit, she will win her husband. Now she can't, but through that process, God could use her to reach her husband and he could get saved. But he also says if the woman stays, her children are sanctified. Same word as holy. Set apart. Does that save the children? Does it say the children? No, it's not saying the children are saved. It's saying the household, the home, is a set apart place, and the children are raised in that set apart place. But there's a point where the children have their responsibility. I don't save my children. You don't save your children. You don't save your grandchildren. But you do everything in your power. You know, I urge you by the mercies of God. I mean, that's what you would want for your children and for your grandchildren and other people that you might know and love. So, it says here, in verses 28 to 36, from the standpoint of the gospel, what is true of Israel?
They're enemies for your sake, from the standpoint of God's choice. They are beloved for the sake of the fathers.
Okay. Do you see the conflict here? From the standpoint of the gospel, from the definition of what it takes to be saved, they're enemies. The unsaved, the unbelieving are enemies of the gospel of God even. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they're beloved. Can you understand that? I mean, you know some of the conflict with my children. with us. I mean, not with all my children, 3 of them, we have 4. 1 is in conflict with us. Does it stop me from loving him? No. But does it make him my enemy? Yeah. He has made himself my enemy. I haven't made him my enemy. But by the definition of what is right and what is wrong and what is should and what is shouldn't be and how, he has made himself an enemy of the definition of our family. I'll put it that way. We didn't make him that. But from my heart standpoint, he's beloved and always will be. But there are still some requirements here. From God's standpoint, it's huger. It's much, much huger than that. That Israel is still beloved of God, goes back and answers the question, he hasn't rejected them. But he also won't just let anybody in just because of their genealogy, just because of their geographic location, just because they're possessors of certain articles like the Bible. Same is true in parallel of Christianity, of what looks like Christianity, or I'll say the visible church as it's called sometimes, which is different. When we say visible church, we're talking about what looks like, the so-called brethren, as opposed to the true and true believers within it. It's a very similar, always was. But one of the most bestest terms in this is in verse 29, and what is that?
Irrevocable. Couldn't quite get that out.
Okay. When you hear the word gift, what do you think of?
Salvation.
Grace.
Grace.
Salvation, yes, by grace. When you hear calling, what do you think of? Chosen. Who does the calling? God. Who gives the gift? God. And they're irrevocable. Can you lose your salvation? No. I mean, that's one way we can apply this. But this is really talking about, it is talking about that, but it's also talking about Israel. Every promise made to Israel that God will fulfill, talked about there will be a fulfillment. Every promise God made to Israel that will be fulfilled gives you the assurance that every promise for us will be fulfilled. Because he's God. And he'll do it. If he said he was going to, it's going to happen. So this assurance is awesome for Israel, but it's awesome for us. I can get really excited about this one. Can you tell? In verse 32, it says, God has shut up all disobedience. Why?
Show mercy.
You might want to explain that one to me. Does it mean that there is no more disobedience? That's not what this means. It doesn't mean there's no more disobedience. It doesn't mean that God has shut up all disobedience. Nobody can disobey anymore. That's not what it means. That he might show mercy to all. That's not what it means. So what would shut up all disobedience? Or what would shut down or shut all disobedience? Shut up all in disobedience. Shut up all in disobedience. Okay. What would shut it up?
Death?
Death? Which death in particular?
Well, the 2/3 of your.
There you go. That's one way. Yeah. He cut that off, right?
Spiritual death.
Spiritual death? Okay, and that would definitely be if you die and you're not his, you're spiritually dead, you're shut up. What would put an end to it? What would make it shut up? Jesus' death. That's another. I mean, I'm not saying any of those are wrong. I think it's all of these. God has shut up all in disobedience. Shut up. How does it say? God has shut up all in disobedience that he might show mercy to all. So if the all here is the all Israel will be saved, and it very well could be, then what he's done is he's made that separation. He's kept the remnant, so that in the ones that were disobedient are all gone at that point. That's absolutely one way this could be talking about. It could also be talking about how did he do it, and that's through the death of Jesus Christ. That all disobedience was answered, is maybe a way of putting it, that he might show mercy to all. I think it could be any of these, but specifically he is talking about Israel, because he goes on and he says in verse, he also, there's another way, it's like, and let's go back to 30. For just as you were once disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient in order that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may be shown mercy. So when he's talking about this relationship between disobedience and mercy, it's talking about you once were disobedient, but now you're not because God showed you mercy. These others have seen that, and they are being shown mercy because their mercy is kind of, that disobedience is going to be put to an end, at least for those called. And then it says, oh, the depths and riches both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. So we got to remember that his judgments are unsearchable and unfathomable. Are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or has become his counselor, or who has first given to him that he might be paid back again? So these are, when it's talking about his judgments are unsearchable and his ways are unfathomable, it's a hard word to say, you can't fathom his ways. The next thing is saying, don't question him. When it's saying this, don't question him. I mean, because I'm going to tell you something. When you start this chapter, or start a lot of this section of the book, it's hard, isn't it? To say, I mean, it's actually in ways, it's easy to look at the Jews and say, well, I understand that. And it might even be saying, I understand why he chose me. It might even be easy to say, I understand why he didn't choose those others. Yeah, we kind of laugh because this is getting a little uncomfortable, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But when it comes to somebody we love, that's when it really hits the nerve. Because we want to say, but God, wait a minute. I want them there. I want them to be saved. Don't tell me they can't be there if I want them there. I love them. And if we really got down to it, let's put it this way, if we actually could do the little test right now and knew who is and who is not chosen, who will or will not go to heaven, we might start questioning God, wouldn't we? Maybe. Because we'd go, why that one when I don't think they're deserving, but not this one when I think this one is? That's when we would start getting into that a little bit, right? And if we start down that path, because trust me, we all can, this is when we need to come back to this truth. Don't question his judgments. Did you give him something that he needs to pay you back?
No.
That's what it's asking. Who gave him something that he should be paid back? We didn't. Who has known the mind of the Lord, and who can become his counselor? Not I. But we start down the path a little bit, don't we, sometimes?
Yeah.
Just be careful, okay? And the thing is, I can't know who is and who is not foreknown and chosen by God. I can know right now, maybe by their life, that they aren't saved, but I can't know that they will not ever get saved.
That's why you pray.
Exactly. Exactly. And even after, let's say, they die and you weren't with them in that last moment, even there was the scientist that died a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yeah.
Can't think of his name. the one that was in the wheelchair,
Stephen Hawkins.
Hawkins. I mean, he was an avowed atheist.
Yes.
You know, outspokenly, absolutely avowed. He said it himself. We don't have to say it about him. But do you know what happened in the last 10 seconds of his life? No. No. So I'm not going to sit here. I'm going to say if he continued in those beliefs, then he's not.
So that's why God gives you a chance till the very end.
Absolutely.
But don't wait till the 11th hour
No.
because he might take you on the 10th hour.
Right. And you may not be able to think in that last little bit. You know, I mean, like you may not be, you know, capable. So yes to both. Yes to both. You don't know, and you could. What, Sandy?
But then there's a judgment.
Absolutely. There is an absolute judgment. And again, I am not to question, if we get to heaven, are you going to start arguing with God about who's supposed to be there? No. It's laughable, but standing on this side, we might kind of start treading a little bit, you know, walking that line a little bit sometimes. And I guess in the sense of when people are starting to try to get their hands on these concepts of the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man, it goes back to God's gracious choice, not ours. Not my ability to save myself and not my ability to save someone else. It's God's gracious choice. Were you going to say something? Okay. And the last thing is, from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. What are the prepositions? From, through, and to.
All things, that's really cool.
It is. It's one of the simplest definitions of sovereignty, right? It all comes back to Him. It started with Him, it's through Him, and it goes back to Him. To Him be the glory. Not just a phrase we say, but truly mean. He gives us His glory, we just reflect it back. In everything we do, hopefully, it would be to His glory. But it's from Him, it's through Him, and it's back to Him, are all things. He's sovereign. So it's by He foreknew, He calls, it's by His gracious choice. It's not based on works. It was never based on works. It's only the chosen are the ones that obtain it. This is where it gets hard, because we don't like to think of God that way. But this is what it says. His judgments are unsearchable and His ways are unfathomable. It's the gifts and callings of God that are irrevocable. We can't know who is and who isn't, so we just spread the message. We just are that instrument, and God allows us to take part in that ministry. But you know, it's also not our place to determine that somebody is when everything about them is saying they're not. And to give them an assurance. You know, Kay says that, I will say that. I will never give someone assurance of their salvation. And that sounds sad, doesn't it? It sounds awful. But I will take them to Scripture and show them they can be assured of their salvation. I just can't be the one to do it.
God can do it.
The Holy Spirit can attest to their spirit that they are a child of God. Their behavior, the fruit of their life, will attest to it. They can maybe go back to a point in time, a fact. That was one thing I was told is, you know, don't go by the feelings because you're going to have doubts. Satan's going to attack your brain. Can you imagine when we were going through all that stuff, especially in the beginning with Matt? We had all kinds of doubts about ourselves as people, ourselves as parents. I mean, I still have those doubts. How can so many people be upset with me and there not be something wrong with me? And that causes that doesn't, I don't dismiss it and go, well, it's them, not me. But there's a part that you just say, and evaluate your behavior. Ask God for forgiveness, do what you can with men, and then, as Paul says, live at peace with all men as much as is possible with you. but also remember and be comforted by Jesus promised us conflicts in this world. If we're living for Him, if we're living by His ways, the world is going to hate us. So if you've got a lot of conflicts, again, I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud that people don't like me. I'm not proud. But,
Rejoicing.
but if I'm in the right, then I can rejoice in it. But that's a tough call. I mean, because I don't arrogantly go around and go, it's everybody else's fault, not mine, or not, not my problem. But you self-evaluate. And Paul tells you to do that, and I say Paul, because he wrote the bulk of this. It's God saying it. But, evaluate yourself. See if you truly are in the faith. Look at your
What if you don't have conflicts?
What's that?
What if you don't have conflicts?
Praise
People
the Lord.
aren't, well, yeah, praising, but am I not doing something right?
That's a tough one because I don't think that everybody's situation's going to be the same.
Yeah.
But it might make you wonder,
It's
are you not
that
speaking
don't-
out enough? Are you not standing for things? I have no idea, Sandy. I'm not saying,
It's not that you don't have conflicts, it's you have a way of handling conflict.
could be.
That-
And there's personalities. I mean, there's different personalities. You look at Paul, but you look at the others in Scripture, you don't see Timothy necessarily going through what Paul went through.
Yeah.
But he calls him his son. I mean, he mentored him completely. So there were different ways potentially, and it was the conflicts that refined Paul, that defined his ministry, gave us hope at times when we might be going through that. Would we stand back and say again, according to the movie, that because I haven't been put in a circus and ripped apart by animals, there's something wrong with me? No. Not everybody in that movie had that happen to them, or that time is really what it's reflecting. So everybody's circumstances are not going to be the same, but you do just have to ask yourself, am I getting along with the world too much? Because I'm going along with the world too much. Do I have no conflicts in my life because nobody knows what I'm standing for? If that's true, then you do have a problem.
Yeah.
But if you're standing and people know exactly where you're standing and you just happen to be running around with people that don't have problems with that, good for you. But, not everybody and their children have children that stray. Not everybody, but you know what, I'm finding there's a lot that do. I'm finding a lot, and it's becoming the norm now, unfortunately, to have somebody like what we're going through. Lots of hurting mother-in-laws out there because their sons have rejected them because of their
the
daughter-in-law.
woman they married.
Yes, it's a pattern.
I know quite a few people who have done that.
And I've had a lot of them coming up to me too. She's saying she knows a lot of people, if you didn't hear what she was saying.
One of my best friends, her brother did that.
Yeah, many. I have many coming and saying that. And so they're suffering quietly, suffering in silence, suffering. You may not have heard their story, but they're there, and it fits right in with Scripture. It says in the end times you're going to have those conflicts in the closest relationships in your life. So, and then, on the other side of it, they may not be the type of people that would walk away. I don't know. So I think in our situation, a lot of it's people who claim to be Christians, and they're rejecting what we say Christianity is. Where if you've got somebody that's truly in the world, they've already, they've already rejected the whole thing. They don't really care that your criteria is Christianity. These people are claiming, well, they're Christians too, and their criteria is more valid than mine, or whatever, whatever they're saying. So they're rejecting my take on Christianity, I guess.
They're also rejecting the word.
That's it. Yeah.
That's that.
Yes.
They're rejecting the truth.
Yes. But they don't see that.
No.
So they reject us because of what we're saying. Yeah, and what we say is true. Did we do everything right? No. There's that too. And we've tried to address that, but they won't. So, you do whatever. Okay, so we're going to stop and say a prayer and then have our food. And this is it for Romans Part 3. is a good way to wrap it up with this understanding of not only has God not rejected Israel, He's not rejected us. So, and won't. The gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. Remember how we went through, what chapter was it? 8. It started with a promise and ended with a promise. This book is so full. I'm sorry?
One of my favorites.
I know, it's awesome. I mean, if you really are having a bad day, go read Romans 8. But also read verse 29 here. Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Father,